mines are required to make financial provision throughout the operating life of mines for closure. And it would be very interesting to see, and most mines don't have enough money for financial provision. So it is, I think, an area for the further work. And Kelly, maybe just to answer part of your question around the MPRDA and how we see it being changed, I think from an environmental perspective, there are a lot of requirements and good requirements in the MPRDA, but they're not always implemented. And I think just yesterday, the Centre for Environmental Rights lodged a court application against the DRMR for the granting of a mining license in a protected area around Wackerstrom. And the environmental impact assessment found that they were going to have irreversible impacts on wetlands, they were going to discharge acid mine drainage in a protected area, and the license was still granted. And so the legislation, there are legal requirements, but they aren't necessarily implemented.
I think it's like the old story of the taxis and the wonderful laws, but they're not being implemented. And that's our biggest problem in this country. If we can't implement this wonderful set of draft legislation that we've got here, we're on a hiding to nowhere, actually. And that's a social issue which is beyond the capacity of this discussion. But it is something that needs to be thought about. The issue of small mines is a very important one. There are, at one time I heard, 1,800 unrehabilitated diamond mines in South Africa, which the government has to somehow find money for. Hence, they have an increasingly growing sensitivity to risk related to mining. And as a result, you will never see, in our lifetime anyway, a mine being closed anymore, because the DMR just doesn't have the money to look after them. And the ones they do have to look after, they can't. So this is a real problem. We have to, whether you nationalize things, ma'am, or you keep them in the government, keep them in private hands, there's no money for that kind of rehab. You go to Woodbank, you walk around Woodbank, people are living next to them, underground fires. I've had them come out of the ground next to me, and they live there, the kids live there. We don't know how many kids disappeared into these holes. It is a serious problem which the government just doesn't seem to be able to get their head around. They do many investigations, they write reports, but when it comes to putting money into the problem, it just doesn't seem to come. The small mine, that's the problem that we're having here. You will see it. Actually, the artisanal Zama mining that's going on in Johannesburg is an example of what you can do on a small scale once you have the access. But coal mine, you don't have the access at this stage because they're all either very large mines and they're flooded, or you can't get underground there. And anyway, the issues there would be horrendous. Except, for instance, around the Eastern Cape, around Mortina, they've been mining there with kids, with hand-loading coal and selling to the local farmers for the last 30 years. And they dealt with this problem, or tried to. You can't stop it unless you close the mine, and they're still going again, like the Zamas do. The big problem with the small mine is that they can't go underground. They want to open cast, they want to get rich quick, and they want to leave the industry. They don't have the technology, in many cases, they don't have the skills. They have to borrow and beg, generally old ex-mining people, whether they're white or black, it's not important, but they have to borrow these people to help them. There's no long-term commitment to the company that whether they own the land or not. They only own the mineral rights. The land ownership is a separate thing, and it was a history of the Roman Dutch law, which was applied in South Africa, which gave water, surface, and mine and mineral rights. And those three real rights have been slowly taken away, and you're left with ownership of the land only. And it is that tension which we are dealing with today. So basically, most of these small mines that are opening up in Mpumalanga are predicated on open cast, strip mining of some kind, which obviously has a major impact. And the biggest issue of all, in my opinion, is the regulatory issue, that there's no proper, consistent regulation of what's happening.
Thanks, Oliver. As you can see, the turn of the conversation has taken us way beyond what we considered in our paper, which was a simple argument around footprint of mining, its linked to increased activities, and then the social and environmental impacts associated with it. But I think just to continue the conversation, I think that the swap contributors have raised issues around the complexity in various areas. The issues around land ownership, land acquisition is an area in itself, and an area of research that is deeply rich and is deep and complex, and developing insights and drawing conclusions about how best to address those situations requires much, a great deal of work that we certainly haven't undertaken in this paper. In the same way, in Mpumalanga, where so much of farmland is under the control and ownership of white farmers, that the impact of that on whether issues get raised appropriately, whether there are issues of ownership there that need to be addressed in and of themselves, if it means that the state takes less or more cognizance of the issues in that area surrounding food security, are not issues that we considered in the course of our paper, but they're issues that are really worth researching and unearthing. Now, I want to come to the point around what you could do in amending the MPDRA, and again, I'm speaking way beyond what we talked about and in producing our paper and research in producing our paper. The first is just a consideration that we need to clarify what is protected land. And in clarifying what is protected land, we might, for example, want to specifically protect land where we have soils that need to be preserved for food security, land where water is generated, for example. What we have at the moment is a process that starts when there is an application for a mining right as to whether it's possible to bring environmental considerations into balance with mining. And the problem with that is that it's on a very narrow frame, and it's a frame that is very localized, and it's not understanding the total dynamic around water or food security in the country. So mining policy, which at the moment is preeminent in terms of the decision making in government, needs to be informed by issues around agriculture and food security. Next point is the point around footprint of mining. Quick one. We need R&D, research around how do we ensure that we can limit that footprint of mining. Mining methods are such that they generate mountains of waste. In South Africa, our R&D capacity is at its lowest level than it has ever been in the country's history when we are faced with these types of challenges. Then the issue of closure. The one point that Oliver's already made. Mines are not closed because when closing a mine, the state then accepts the responsibility for that land, so it's not closed. Also, mines are not closed because there's an assumption that there will be new technology that will allow us to return to that mine and extract more minerals, or we could in fact mine and extract value from the mine waste. So again, there's a decision here, and from my own perspective, we need to think about how we close mining land and repurpose it on a large scale, so that land is utilized in different ways, and in that utilization, there's an active management of the impacts of mining. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are really going to have to squeeze this last round. Swaps property rights in this room are very tenuous. And in our case, if we overuse it, we'll lose it. And we've only got a few minutes left. And on top of that, I can only go for 4 people, which we had at the end. I'm afraid you've already had a go. And we're going to have to ask you to please be really disciplined with your contribution or your question. If it goes on for more than about 30 seconds, I have to start clapping my hands. But no, I'm afraid I can't. I'm afraid I can't. But also as well, please remember to tell us who you are and what your affiliation is. So we're going to start at the back with Eric, then we'll go to Jean, then we'll go to Jane, and then we'll go to you at the front. That's the order in which we'll do it to help Makani. So starting with you, Eric.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric. I'm with the Benchmarks Foundation. I'm also the member of the Trend Fires Association. I think a lot of, I must say, first I welcome the presentation. It's very enlightening. The questions that I would want to ask, it's MPRDA in relation with other laws. You really have mentioned or put out there that there are a lot of environmental impacts there. I was wondering, really, the MPRDA itself, as it is now, does it not conflict with other laws as it's been implemented? And the other question is that you speak of re-evaluation and adjustment of the MPRDA. Well, I know in other quarters of the society, people are saying it must just be scrapped because it does not necessarily benefit. You have highlighted the shortcomings of it, and in a sense, it has extended all the suppressions of the past. My question on that is, don't you think it's about time that we start afresh and get a new act around the mining regime? Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for being so disciplined. So, Jean, please.
Hi, I'm Jean-Patrick Leger. I had an early association with SWAP and I run a manufacturing business. I really found that presentation very interesting. And I want to sort of contrast the growth in the amount of land that is clearly under prospecting and potential mining with what is my impression of the industry, where we've seen these employment figures as a whole just disappear. And the consequence of that have been, for example, in the metal industry, losing so many jobs of people that were manufacturers in South Africa for mining equipment. Now, it might be structural that all that equipment is now coming in from abroad, but I was just wondering if you can all talk about, it seems that the Act has achieved its objective of diversifying ownership. But what is happening to the industry? What is happening to the overall production? There's maybe a bigger problem is that when we saw the commodity boom, we did not develop our mines, whereas everyone else did. So we just, mine decreased in this country during that time. Well, that's my impression. So I really like your comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you. And then to Jane. And just before you speak, Jane, an announcement as well, which is our next breakfast seminar in this series on mining, metals and society will be on the 16th of October. It will be the same time, the same place, and it will be Victor Munich talking a little bit further up the value chain, talking about the ArcelorMittal case and its impact on the local community, which raises questions of the law and environment and local communities. And Victor will be drawing on his PhD research and an active participation within that struggle. So that will be our next one, Friday, the 16th of October. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks. I'm Jane Barrett from COSATU. I've got a suggestion and then a sort of reflection and question. The suggestion is, I was very interested in that graph on global community protests and conflicts. And the suggestion seemed to be that nothing's been done locally of a similar nature to analyze the South African context. And I guess it's a suggestion that maybe SWAP or somebody could take up a project together with the UJ people, Peter Alexander and so on, who are doing regular national analyses of community conflicts. And it would be very interesting to explore specifically where those conflicts are directly related to mining activities. The second is I guess it's a reflection and a question, if anybody, perhaps May in particular, wants to answer, and that is, what is going on in our national psyche that we accept this predominance and preeminence of the mining sector when we know its history, its exploitative presence, and so on. I mean, we can explain it in class terms, we can explain it in terms of immediate interests of capital and certain politicians and so on, but there seems to me to be something much bigger and more deep-rooted that's going on, that we are unable, even in progressive circles, to assert a different hierarchy of interests that puts water and food back at the top of the hierarchy in our planning and so forth.
Thank you. And finally to Elaine at the front.
Hi, I'm Elaine from Mining Weekly. Just in terms of the MPRDA, I just wanted to analyse the fact that the MPRDA doesn't exist by itself. It exists within a stream of other legislation, NEMA, the National Water Act, the Mining Charter, and then there's CSI initiatives, part of the mining codes. Now, is it not fair to say that all these things on their own regulate the mining industry, and the MPRDA in itself, you can't just look at it and say that it's the main cause of all the ills that fall the mining industry, whether in terms of environment or in terms of not doing enough for society. And do you not think that in many ways this paper it's lacking because it doesn't take into account the broader legislative environment, that it kind of binds the mining codes, the mining industry, just in terms of that, all these laws are very progressive in nature, and they talk to empowering of communities, particularly the Mining Charter, CSI initiatives that are part of the mine's code of practices. And you don't feel that is something that's very important to look on, because the MPRDA scope, although it's the main body of law for the mining industry, doesn't exist on itself, and there are broader codes that have to be taken into account when looking at the mining industry and its progression impact on society and environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we just go to the panel, and panel, I'm afraid you have to be quite brief before we close eviction.
I'll start again. Just to answer the environmental questions, which I find much easier to answer. The MPRDA, Eric's question in terms of the conflict with other environmental laws, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but as of the end of, I think it was the 5th of December last year, there was an attempt, and it's been over many years, to try and align the MPRDA with other kinds of other environmental legislation. And that came into force more or less in December last year, where now water legislation, environmental legislation, and mineral legislation is all aligned in terms from an environmental perspective. It's the single environmental system. Part of that has been put on hold because the regulations weren't all in place, and there was an Aquarius Platinum took it to the Constitutional Court earlier in the year. I'm not sure subsequently what has happened. That was partly to address the concern that the MPRDA and the Department of Mineral Resources are both have the role of promoting mining as well as policing it from an environmental perspective. So it addressed that in part, but a number of people feel that it was a compromise, and it was turning and froing between the departments. So although now mining the environmental side of mining is regulated in terms of the National Environmental Management Act, it still falls under the Department of Mineral Resources. So officials from the Department of Mineral Resources have to enforce environmental legislation. And that, we will see how that plays out. It's still early days. And then just comes back to your query around the other forms of legislation. And I think our main concern is around the use it or lose it clause in the MPRDA. And we're not for 1 minute saying that it's good to be hoarding and to be sitting on your mineral rights. but we do need to be a little bit more strategic around the rate of mining. And essentially what the use it or lose it clause has resulted in is that if there's land, you need to grab it and mine it within a year. So we're needing to look at that, and we're not saying sit on it either, but we need to be more strategic around that.
Thanks. I'm going to be very brief, and I just want to address Jean-Pierre's question in a broader sense than the way you posed it, which is that the idea of an expansion of economic activities and a decrease in jobs is something that we see not only in the mining sector but in general in the economy. And I think that sort of thinking far beyond even what this paper is about and even beyond your question, we can look to things like James Ferguson's recent book talking about the importance of the debate surrounding basic income grants, precisely because at some point we're going to have to acknowledge that we're living in, we have to acknowledge that full employment is a pipe dream, right? Whether it's in mining or any other sector. And so then we need to start thinking about what other mechanisms of redistribution can be put in place that will allow people to partake in the benefits of these activities, even if they won't be employed by them directly.
Okay, I think just to build on what Joshua has already said, one of the issues that have come up in relation to the impacts on jobs that are associated with the mining sector, obviously is because of the increasing capital intensity of mining, but also that the requirements around empowerment and access to the mining sector broadly, not only in terms of mining license, has not been necessarily linked to local manufacture. And that's an issue that has cropped up with in the revised mining charter. So that you could enter the mining industry on the basis of importing goods from elsewhere and be a supplier and get preferential access to that opportunity because of the fact that you qualified as a black economic empowered entity. I don't know, Jane, why mining is so preeminent in the country. Obviously, it has been the cornerstone of the industrialization of the country, and even if one looks at the National Development Plan, central to that is around diversifying the economy off a mining base. And I think there's some really deep reflection that needs to be done there. Possibly also the idea of how one looks at jobs and development in relation to water issues and in relation to food and agriculture is not an equation that seems to match up to the idea that mining and all the industries that can range around it would create more jobs. But clearly there's a need for some thinking around that. In terms of why the MPDRA is central to our paper, it is the MPDRA that